Welcome to the Rugby Coach Weekly Round Up Rodeo. I'm your host, Phil Llewellyn. Thank you for joining us for Season 3, where we continue to explore all things sports coaching. My guests are going to present their key learnings from a piece of content of their choosing, and we then discuss its application. Three excellent guests join me again this week, so please could you introduce yourselves and tell us your current role?
Hello, my name's Edward Hall. I'm a researcher, educator, mentor and consultant in sport coaching, and I currently work at Northumbria University.
I'm Ryan Thomas. I'm a lecturer at Plymouth Marjon University. I've also got a background in sports development as a sports development officer, coach educator, and I'm also still a practicing coach.
My name's Adam Nichol. I'm a teaching fellow at Durham University, coach with Northumberland Cricket Board's Pathway and a coach developer with the ECB at the moment.
Absolutely fantastic. Gents, a real pleasure to have all of you on. Really keen to get into this discussion. Just before we do, quick reminder for anyone listening to check out the blurb on Rugby Coach Weekly for links to all the content we discuss and recommendations to other high quality content. So, Ed, we are coming over to you to kick us off. What is it you're going to talk to us about?
The thing I've chosen to talk about is something that I picked up again recently, having seen it a long time ago, because we got Disney Plus during lockdown, keep the kids entertained. And lo and behold, there was Remember the Titans, the film from way back in 2000. And actually, I use this film as or at least snippets of it, as a teaching resource on my final year module at Northumbria University. And so I have to acknowledge as well that it was actually Professor Paul Potrak who was the one who initially suggested how we might use this film as a way to explore some of the important issues that I'm going to talk about. So the film, for a bit of background, is set in the 1970s in the state of Virginia in America. And it's based on the true story of a Black American football coach who's portrayed by Denzel Washington. There's a bit of Hollywood dramatic license in terms of a true story, but it's a great storyline and there's a fantastic cast and the soundtrack's really good as well. Now, what this film does is it traces the struggles of the coaches and the players, as well as their wider families and communities, as they struggle to adapt to the recent integration of what were previously racially segregated public schools. And of course, then obviously the integration of the school's American football team. And obviously diversity and inclusion remains a really important issue and still sadly has great relevance to us in sport and broader society. Not just in terms of race, of course, but ethnicity, in terms of gender, sexuality, age, disability, and so on. However, if you look beyond these sort of bigger societal issues, it's actually the more subtle features of the real world coaching in the film that really caught my eye. And that it obviously caught the eye of Hollywood as well in terms of wanting to tell an engaging and authentic story about this world. I think it's actually interesting that the producers and the director really zoomed in on these central features of coaching. But it raises questions, I think, for coach education and development, because ironically, it's these things that make the film feel so familiar to me and to other coaches who watch it. And yet it's also these things about what it means to be a coach that have traditionally been absent from or under-researched or under-appreciated within the training and development courses that are offered to practitioners. So in terms of a couple of specifics about what I love about this film, we're talking here about the fact that coaching is fundamentally a social activity. It can't be completed without social interaction. And because of these interactions, which are intentional and typically occur over a period of time, coaching is also fundamentally about relationships. Now, people do often talk about the coach-athlete relationship, but as the film shows, this is a pretty simplistic approach to understanding what goes on in the real world, because a coach's relationship with any one player never occurs in a vacuum, in isolation from other interactions and relationships. Instead, they're always enmeshed together in a much wider and more complex web of relationships. So how the coach treats one athlete in public will have implications how the other athletes around at that time might expect to be treated and will therefore act towards the coach themselves. And I don't think we give enough thought to this currently. The second point would be that in this film, coaches interact with and must attempt to generate productive working relationships with a range of different stakeholders that go beyond the athletes we typically focus on. So these include people like co-coaches and board members and parents and the support services that are often available. So as the film highlighted, the coach's key role is actually one of trying to influence and persuade various people, because generating buy-in and alignment, dealing with conflict and repairing relationships are therefore essential skills. And this isn't just about the fluffy stuff or the soft social skills we might talk about often. It's about the tough stuff, the tough social skills, like being able to negotiate robustly and to stand your ground in the face of opposition, staying true to your mission and values, again, in the face of significant pressures. And underpinning this is the fact that when we coach, we encounter significant challenges in doing our jobs well, just as the coach in this film does. So I suppose within this, there's 4 key elements. The first is that we only ever exert limited control over others. Denzel was a pretty tough coach, quite authoritarian. And yet in the film, people still resisted him. So he was never in total command of things. The second point is that coaches also have limited awareness of what's happening in their environments. So we can't always know what people are truly thinking and feeling. And so we're constantly making decisions in the face of incomplete information. The third point is that the various stakeholders that the coach was interacting with held sometimes contradictory beliefs and expectations, not only to the coach, but also to one another. And so if we want to get people on side and keep them on side, we need to be quite astutely capable of considering their different interests and motives and thinking strategically and deeply about how it is we're going to go about getting them to follow our lead. And then as a final point, just to add to further complexity to all of this, which again was really evident in the film, the strategies that the coach might use, which might be influential with one person or group, are never guaranteed to work in the same way with any other person or group, nor are they likely to be consistently successful with the same people over time. And so just to bring all of that together, I think the film really helped me to look at a number of key features of coaching that are currently underserved or ignored in a majority of coach education and development content. And perhaps people would watch this film again with a different set of goggles on, almost noticing some of the things that I've tried to highlight there.
Fantastic, thank you. No, it's a really great start. I love the fact that you've stated you got Disney just because of the kids, when we all know we really got it for us as adults, and it's a benefit if the kids get to watch it as well. I guess my first question is, and I've touched on this before, but actually, how much do you think we learn from coaching from Hollywood? And I'm always of the mind that we may get to experience, even as like our first steps into coaching, will have always, the chances are, will have been coach or will have seen some coaching. But an awful lot of sports movies have done really well at the box office, and I'm just wondering what level of influence actually do we get from films like this and Coach Carter and all these types of things, and actually do they, when you look at it in this kind of detail, maybe there is a bit of reality in there as well as the glitz and the glamour, or is there a danger of the classic Al Pacino halftime speech and all those types of things? Is there a danger that we get a complete misconception of coaching from what we see in the movies?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because in some ways these movies encapsulate, at least for me, a lot of what it meant when I started out coaching, this belief that sport could serve this fantastic purpose, it could bring people together, that I could be of value to my community and wider social life because I could help people and bring something to the equation. And I think a lot of that summed up in a lot of the films that you mentioned, that sport is this fantastic social phenomenon that can bring people together and spans and can bridge a number of significant gaps. But equally at the same time, the story of coaching told in these stories and films, they often paint the coach in the picture of being a sort of superhero that engages in these incredibly heroic and successful acts of influence and persuasion and immediate changes in the outlook or perspective of those people that they're working with. And in reality, although we may have one or two of those types of moments in our careers as coaches, in reality, what we're doing all the time are these much more subtle steering motions of nudging people and gently influencing them as we're responding to and picking up on the emergent nature of the interactions that we're having and our understanding of the settings that we're in. And I think that's one of the things that we find so valuable about Remember the Titans, because a lot of that heroic stuff, you can look past it and actually get to grips with some of these more complex and subtle realities, the nuances of what it means to actually be a coach, which is the stuff that when you then tie it in with the research that's currently being done by some fantastic scholars, that's where their attention is. It's on this nitty gritty, nuanced, micro level interactive stuff, which is really where the future of our development as a discipline and area, practically and theoretically, will be.
And I think you've nailed it there. I also wonder if that's the piece that we maybe just don't see initially. We see good coaches, and I often wonder about the kind of the transition of ex-professionals straight into coaching. Do they see, well, I understand the game, and I could tell somebody what to do on the grass, or I can like almost regurgitate some of the stuff. And I think this is probably what any new coach would do, but it's almost the hard work of coaching is in developing those relationships and understanding them. So I open this question out, but I was trying to think back when you were talking then to actually how much of any kind of formal or informal coach education really talked about relationships. And I'm wondering where you guys would suggest that either coach education needs to go in terms of developing better coaches who understand and can develop stronger and increased and more efficient relationships, or actually is there just somewhere else we need to be looking at this type of stuff? Because it's clearly something we would have in our everyday life. But again, I don't ever, other than that kind of awkward advice you maybe get from some people when you're having girlfriend or boyfriend trouble or something like that, how much do people ever sit you down and go, this is how relationships work and this is what emotional intelligence is? And there's just so much to this that we're expected to know because we do it away from coaching. And again, not necessarily successfully. It's this huge part of coaching, I would argue, that just goes, well, yeah, you'll be fine with that. We'll just look at the technical tactical stuff. Yeah, interesting in where you think, or how you think we go about maybe developing that within everyday coaching.
I don't mind jumping in here. I think from my experiences of being a coach educator, I think even from that role and also being a candidate on many of the courses, the reality was it was rarely covered, those types. It was about the X's and the O's. And I would say that many of those experiences and being able to deal with people with their different backgrounds and their own motivations and understanding those and appreciating that those will slowly meander and mesh and people may divert off into different routes and so on. I think that comes from those other wider experiences. And from it's a sweeping statement to make, but many of the educators that I was in contact with, some of the most gifted ones were from a teaching background. So they were able to recognize difference, to understand each candidate and their own journey and where they were coming from. And they were skills that they had learned in classrooms and in college classrooms, etc., all over the country. And that, I feel, was probably where they could add some value. But those particular tutors were able to add that on almost informally. And where they were perhaps going a little bit overboard, but sometimes reined in by a senior coach educator that would say, well, don't forget, you've got to cover the content. There's things that you're going a bit off piste here. Make sure you stay on message. And that I found quite often, even from my point of view, was a little bit frustrating on many occasions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I completely agree with what's been said to now. I think a lot of it is often assumed people implicitly have these skills, or it's an innate trait or characteristic which people have and something which can't be developed, which I would argue isn't the case personally. I think we can develop these skills in and through coach education. And as Ryan and Ed mentioned there, I think we develop them in our broader experiences of work, of day-to-day relationships with family and friends. So there's a lot to be drawn on there. And I think building that into coach education alongside the technical, which is also very important to recognise as well. But I would agree in that there hasn't been probably as much focus on the relationship side of things, the understanding influence, who we might need to influence and why, what people's agendas are and how we might need to navigate or negotiate those in a skillful manner. And I think that social element, that how we can be positively related to other people and positively influence. I think often people can sometimes view these things as being inherently negative. And if we speak about sort of anything to do with politics, then everybody thinks, oh, it's a negative term. Whereas actually for me, it can be to do with both, that can be the case, but it can also be about collaboration, negotiation and working together positively as well.
Yeah, and I think some of the issues where this comes from is that actually when we talk about relationships in our everyday lives and developing the skills there, we're not sat at home with people going, can I talk to you about what I was thinking around how I'm going to interact with this person? It's always implicit, isn't it? It's always a skill that we've developed implicitly, but equally it's a skill that we've developed in context. So we've learned how to operate, navigate, and interact with groups of people within a particular frame or context. And then we've learned how to adapt that, perhaps through errors and opportunities, to fit with different situations, different groups, and different contexts. When we go on coach education courses, they're typically decontextualized. So the people that we're typically interacting with, the local realities that we deal with in our everyday practice aren't there. And so one of the ways that we've found has been very beneficial to the students and the coaches that we support through professional development initiatives is to work through scenarios and to actually explore, well, how would you deal with this situation in an interactive way? You've just been approached by two sets of parents who are unhappy about your selection decisions this week. You've agreed to meet with them at the weekend separately. How are you going to plan and prepare for that? What are you going to be thinking about? What do you understand about their interests, and how have you interacted with them previously that might give you a guide towards what's about to come? And then suddenly we can start to unpack what's going on here. And for us, really, I think, as Adam rightly said, it's not that the technical, tactical, psychosocial, and physiological components of coaching are unimportant. It's that they can only work to their best, if you like, if they're delivered by people who have a good level of relational astuteness, the ability to interact well with people. And so I would see this stuff being at the very core of how we try to support coaches, because I think it would shift the conversation away or it would shift the conversation from being almost exclusively about what to do to suddenly being more about, again, coming back to the film, which I think is so unique about it in some ways, the how and the why. So the film didn't really focus on the X's and the O's and the drills that were done, and it was really about the interactions, the how and the why of the coaching that was going on, which I found so fascinating.
Yeah, and I would say that although that film was obviously based on Hollywood and the kind of performance and elite environment, this is really appropriate for grassroots community coaching as well. The pressure that a coach is under now in terms of neoliberal coaching environments and all the pressures of getting qualified, staying qualified, messages from the governing body and understanding what their requirements are on you as the coach, then how that may be in conflict with maybe senior coaches at your own club who may have a different view of how you should be developing those players, and then different parents within that group, and then different player needs within that. Who would be a coach now? It's really challenging, even as a volunteer in a role that allegedly carries much less pressure. But I think for many novice coaches, unless they're exposed to it enough, I'm sure the three of us are trying to do our best to do it through degree programs and so on, is that unless they're exposed to these realities of coaching, they're quite often then really a rabbit in the headlights in those early sort of a few months in the role, thinking this wasn't covered on my course. I'm really not sure how to deal with this angry person, or we're painting it quite negatively sometimes, or this person is lavishing praise and I'm feeling quite uncomfortable about it, and how I might contextualize that as me as a coach. What does this mean for me and my identity? So I think I think you used the words, the fluffy stuff. It is perhaps seen as being the fluffy stuff, but I think it's as important as the X's, the technical.
That actually leads quite interestingly into a bit of a rabbit hole that was talked around on Twitter this week. And I'm not sure who originally tweeted it around teaching and around the importance or not of relationships, and do they even exist, and this concept of relationships. And I think Dan Cottrell retweeted it and just asked the same from a coaching perspective. And there were some just really interesting examples around actually, do lots of people consider it the fluffy stuff? And does that but just take away a little bit more of its meaning? I guess some of them were inferring, and Twitter's always difficult for that, but actually if we see it as, oh, we're just friends, and actually it's not about me influencing you. I get the role of a coach, and again, influence can be seen as a negative word, but I think the role of the coach is to influence people, and you can do that in a variety of ways. But actually just the fact that I don't think it ever occurred to me until that point that people might not think that relationships are important, or they are. I would argue that the very heart of coaching, how can I try and get you to change and improve and develop and do all these other things that I want you to do without actually having any sort of relationship with you? That just hadn't hadn't really registered with me. I guess my question within that is actually how do you guys define relationship? Because it does seem to be this really catch-all title, and actually is there something a little bit more specific that we're missing within that?
Yeah, I actually responded to Dan's sort of provocation. I think that, is a good grenade to throw in. And I think some of this comes from the fact that on Twitter and in other environments, when something that's quite complex, not necessarily complicated, but complex and involving multiple features and facets and dimensions is discussed, then you throw in a word like relationships as if it's the panacea to solving all of those things. And naturally people go, it's just not that simple. And it isn't that simple, but it is sufficiently complex if you get into the depth of what relationships are and how they're performed and enacted and made and remade and co-constructed in the everyday ebb and flow of interaction that's going on. And to come to this question about what relationships are, again, it's interesting because there are various different perspectives. When you actually boil it down, I think Crosley offers the best sort of perspective on this when he talks about this idea that it's essentially a history of interaction and the expectation of future interaction. So I can interact with somebody on a one-off occasion without any anticipation that I'll ever see them again. That's not necessarily a relationship. That's an association or an interaction at that time. But when I become tied to people, as coaches typically are, because they have coached them last week, they're expecting them to turn up this week, and there'll be another session in a week's time, and they're probably going to be there for that as well, then how I'm acting today is built upon what I learned about interaction with that person last week, and then also how I want to interact with that person a week down the line, because whatever I do in this situation is going to shape and inform their treatment of me and my treatment of them and our expectation of how we'll next be together. And I think the great way to think about this is, somebody once was interviewed and they were talking about what made their marriage so successful, and they said, we never go to bed on an argument. And when they asked them to explain that a bit further, they said, I hate the feeling of waking up in the morning and not knowing how we're going to treat each other. And I think that highlights this idea that a relationship is something that has a history, but it also has a future. And we need to be acutely aware of that as we're acting in the present.
I remember that thread as well, actually, on Twitter. I think I may have contributed myself. It was interesting. It was almost as controversial as it depends versus ecological dynamics, but we won't go down that route. That was a long few days. Here, I think for me, I just mentioned Crossley, using a fair bit of his work myself in my own PhD. So I think my own perception of relationships is fairly similar in that this idea that we are agents in constant web of relations with each other. And I think the web bit is important for me. If, as a coach, I have a relationship with that player, and that's what much coach education would encourage us to focus on, improve the players. But my perception on what's important in that coaching environment, the way that I coach, what I believe to be right and wrong, is influenced by so many other things as well. My education, my family background, and my interactions there, my history of interaction in those particular environments will impact upon the way that I work in my own coaching environment. And similarly with that player, their parents' beliefs, what they did at school that day, and again, those histories and then future interactions impact upon the way that we interact in that particular moment as well. So I think it's probably important to recognize that relationships go beyond just a simple dyad of the two individuals, and it goes impacted through our participation in other networks. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes the environments that we are in and the relationships that we have to form are not of our choosing. So sometimes as coaches, we are plonked into an environment, or we have to interact with people that we may not choose to do so in many other situations. So sometimes for us as coaches, that can become incredibly stressful, and we either choose to ignore those individuals, maybe to the detriment of the people that we're working with, or we have to choose to interact with them and moderate our behavior, which again, when we're driving home in the car, becomes a really horrible thing. And you see the WhatsApp light up again, you think, oh God, here we go. And it ruins the rest of your evening. So I'm sure we've all been there.
I'd completely agree as well. I think I really like the analogy and the sort of understanding of relationships being more than just a dyad. I think often research and some development opportunities can position it as a very dyadic position where you need to influence and foster good relationships on an individual level, which is clearly very important. But I think understanding, as Ed and Ryan have mentioned there, the wider, almost spider's web, if I've heard a few people talk about it as, and how you're connected to those different individuals, and what the implications, if you do influence or not one individual, how can that also have a knock-on effect on other people? So I've heard a good example from a number of contexts where head coaches purposefully communicate with the leadership group to sell a particular strategy, a particular tactic that they want to employ before they will then present that to the rest of the group. And in and through the process of doing that, they then perhaps have a more effective or a better influence on other people than if they'd just gone in and presented that to the whole group initially without that consultation. And I think often understanding from some work that we've done in the past, how our interactions can have an unintended influence to what we had originally pictured. I think as coaches, we often have a mental understanding of what our influence is, and if we've delivered a particular behaviour, whether that's praise or whether it's standing back and observing, doing nothing, we often assume that our practice has had a particular influence, when actually the perception of that practice from the other people involved, if that be the players, assistant coaches, board of directors, they can often have a very different picture of that specific behaviour, that specific practice. So often how our behaviour goes beyond just influencing, as others have mentioned, the dyad, and how actually, I think there's a really good example as well from some research where a player or a coach that I was studying at the time that we were working together had praised an athlete or scolded an athlete in the middle of the pitch. And when I'd asked him about his intentions behind that, it was to foster a change for that player who was in the middle of the field only. And when I interviewed some of the other players who were sitting on the sidelines watching, they said, oh, that made me think about how I was then going to play when I went into bat later on. So I think having a wider understanding of perhaps how our behaviour can have that unintentional influence and almost a knock-on impact on a number of different individuals, and trying to anticipate that before we behave and then reflect on that after we have behaved can often be a very important thing to consider.
I have to say, I love the web analogy, and I'm just thinking, I would say you see it quite often, certainly in junior rugby clubs, you'd hear stories about there's been a bit of tension almost, and suddenly someone's fallen out with someone and the coach has left, but he or she has taken half the team with them to wherever they've gone to coach next. And you just go, yeah, perfect example. How interconnected is that it was their son or something, and then all their mates, and it's just that kind of, that ripple and knock-on effect, which is very interesting. My last question on this was, I am already conscious of time, but do you think, and this was just a real random thought around, as a coach's epistemological position potentially, or just their kind of preference for how they engage with athletes, do you think coaches that would maybe put themselves at the IP end of the spectrum might be less enthused about relationships? Do you think actually our approach to how we see human beings almost would then define potentially the importance we put on relationships? If I'm a little bit more of a directive coach, does it bother me less that I don't have a great relationship with you, because I'm just thinking actually my job is to give you this information and for you to process that and deal with it? Whereas somebody, I guess, maybe towards the other end of the spectrum might be a little bit more, I've got to have a really effective relationship with you because I need to be able to talk to you and question you and understand what's under the hood almost. And I've got no idea if there's any research out there on it, but it was just one of those kind of thoughts that went, if there isn't, actually, it might be a kind of a fascinating area to explore into, but it's probably quite a big generalization.
I think you're absolutely bang on. The part of the work that we do through the module and the CPD that we've delivered across a range of different contexts to coaches working at a number of different levels, the approach we take is to first set out, if you like, the default position that's often taken through coach education and some research in terms of how they present a picture of what coaching is and how coaching happens, and where that suggests that the coach is somebody who is doing some stuff towards or at some other people, then potentially there's a big barrier there in terms of recognizing that those people might do some stuff back to you, and that might include aligning themselves with you. It might include resisting the things that you're trying to do towards or with them, and that therefore the behavior you've done towards them wasn't an end point. It wasn't an event. It's the start of a journey that you're about to go on that could end up in various different places. And Adam alluded to that point before in terms of the unintended consequences of your interactions. And it's only really then, I think, when we've broken down, this is how coaching is often portrayed. And here's a set of evidence that shows us that actually coaching is so much more than that we can then start to develop skills. And this is really the kind of practical element that then it's about developing a set of personal skills. So an awareness of oneself and our own behavior, an awareness of people and situations in order to recognize the dynamics that are occurring within that environment and the different interests that are in play. Then evidently there's the bridge between the self and these other people, which is the interpersonal skills that I think most people would recognize as being really important within coaching. And that those things coming together will then allow us to build the alignments and the alliances that we need in order to be able to enjoy a good set of working conditions, but also so that we can just get some stuff done, and that stuff, it has some purpose and some intention. And I think when we get really good at this stuff, that we then maybe have some strategic direction that's aware of, if you like, thinking about what's coming over the horizon and where we're going to and what's coming next. And I think those are the kind of things that could be included more in coach education. But before we get to that, we've almost got to do what we've been talking about, which is we've got to persuade people that coaching is a certain thing, and maybe not the thing or the picture that's been advocated and promoted through, again, not just coach education, but typically the way that we talk about things as coaches, almost as heroes and dynamic doers of things towards people, and actually towards being collaborators in the production of a coaching process.
Yeah, I think I would agree with much of that. I think when you asked the question, the first thing that came to my mind was that word I used earlier about neoliberalism, and around how coaching generally has been viewed as something that is measurable, linear, almost dispassionate. Coaching is important to improving sports performance, so therefore let's measure it and ensure that we can find some outcomes that can justify either future funding or someone going on a coach education course. And I think sometimes, and again, it's not saying that the things that have come out from that kind of approach to coaching aren't important. Clearly, the X's and the O's and the monitoring the effectiveness of different behaviors and so on are really important. But I think sometimes by doing so, you remove some of the nuance and the grey areas that actually is where most of our stresses lie. The bits before the session, during the session, and after are quite often those. Did that player quite get that? What was that parent really thinking when I came out with that coaching point that I thought was world class, but they were looking like they were frowning, and all those different bits and pieces. So it goes back to, again, to what we value in the coaching environment. And perhaps the context is really important here. Perhaps in some performance environments, it may have to be that way, that we're looking to measure and find rules to whatever it is that we are coaching. And perhaps there is more flexibility in a community, in a grassroots environment to form those more meaningful relationships, particularly because you aren't likely to get sacked if your results don't go the right way. But yeah, for me, it certainly comes back to that fact that the nuance is important and the context is actually really important in terms of defining how we can shape that moving forwards.
Yeah, I think for me, the roles and the role norms that people interpret are really important in understanding how and why people might behave in particular ways. And I think how athletes would frame the role of different coaches, be it a head coach and an assistant coach. And for me, I think the big thing here is the power dynamics between those individuals, and understanding how people experience and enact their roles on the back of that, how they feel that they fit into a squad, or what they feel their particular role is as a coach, or indeed as an athlete who, as Ed and Ryan mentioned, you might have some resistance against coaches as advocated, or a desire to follow to the letter what has been said. So understanding their own perceptions of the power which they afford to people, I think is really important in navigating some of those complexities, and understanding why people would or wouldn't follow a particular instruction, a piece of praise or feedback, or whatever that might be.
Fantastic. I think this is something we could probably talk about for a lot longer. I guess we'll kind of park that one there, but Ryan, we're going to come across to you when I think kind of some of this stuff probably links with your piece as well. Yeah, very interested to see where we go.
Yeah, I think it will. A lot of the things that come out from the thing that I've chosen would certainly come out once again. Rather than choosing a film, I was going to choose Will Ferrell's Kicking and Screaming. I'm not sure if any of you have seen that. There's loads of lessons around how coaches act on the sideline, and I've used it in a few lectures myself, normally to just lighten the mood slightly. But because Ed went for a film, I've gone for an academic paper. It was a particular paper written by Professor Paul Potrak, so we've mentioned him already, so you probably tell our influences straight away. It was one of those papers that really resonated with me, because it was, after reading about the first couple of pages, it was like finally someone has said what we quite often always think. It talked quite a lot about Paul's early career in the game of football and the professional game and working in academy football, and how quite often wearing that club stadium jacket with the logo on helps to fuel the ego and the identity. And for me, that was quite an important read in that first page, because it was like, that's how I got into doing that kind of coaching as well. It was wearing the jacket became like a badge of honor. Members of the family were really proud that you'd got these certain level of coaching badges and you were working for a respected local football club, and that it was almost like oh, you've made it, well done. And for me, the X's and the O's in terms of coaching was never something that really worried me at all. I always felt that I could go and do my research and find out a particular session and edit and adapt it and use it as well as I could. But the thing that I always found difficult was those relationships that I was forming whilst I was coaching. This was the same in performance as well as participation environments. So I always felt that this was a bit of an underlying issue in coaching, the realities, the messy nuance, the micro-political games, that word will come up again in a minute. But there was this whole feeling that coaching wasn't necessarily always about you and the player and the sort of the actual practice working. It was about the relationships that you form with your co-coaches, the relationships that you form with those players, and the ones you got on with, the ones you didn't get on with. And what I really liked, the first thing that I'll probably highlight about this particular article, called Handshakes, Barbecues and Bullets. It's an excellent piece of work. The first thing that really shines for me is the fact that Paul, as the coach, really shows honesty and vulnerability. And for me, coaching can be quite an ego-driven activity. Is quite a lot around the coaching courses that we've done, the places that we've worked, the people we've interacted with. There's lots of coaches I know have got their little black book of players that they've worked with and developed and are now playing at a really high level. And what I really like about this article is the vulnerability that he shows in saying, I didn't like this, or I found this challenging. And for me, that there's not enough of that in coaching. And one thing that we debated with our first year students only a couple of weeks ago on a coaching module was that very topic, is how coaches can actually use reflective practice in a meaningful way to show vulnerability. So that was the first thing that really came out to me. The other one was this use of micro-politics. And what Paul talks about in the article is the fact that he felt he was constantly looking over his shoulder, because there was this, he perceived to be a rather calculating and uncaring environment and a lack of collegiality. So talking and going on a little bit further from what we mentioned earlier around coaches looking over their shoulder and influenced by interactions with other people, he mentions in the article about how he would be in the middle of running a particular part of the session. His co-coach would see maybe the first team manager or the academy head walking over, would notice and see his opportunity to pounce, and would go, right, Paul, that's not working. I'm just going to change this bit up here. And so that was a natural, sort of a thing that he had experienced on quite a few occasions. And what he found as well is that that became norms and accepted practices, and to the point where he actually did that to a young coach himself, because that was the environment that had been created by that club. So he talked about coaching environments being quite competitive, ego-driven. And I love the fact that he showed the honesty and the vulnerability, which kind of shed a new light on some of those emotional features of coaching practice. But it also really highlighted the fact that those relationships, for me, could go beyond coach and player or coach and athlete, because it's quite clear that your relationship with co-coaches is important. And this particular article set me really on my way with my own PhD journey, through looking at Paul's work of the negotiated, the sort of difficult and the grey and the messy features of coaching, to say, can we go further than that? This particular article went beyond coach-athlete relationships into coach relationships specifically. But then I started thinking, well, what if we go further than that? What about coach-player-parent? What about coach-player-parent performance director? What about coach-player-parent performance director scout? And then I've opened this whole Pandora's box in my own head now, using the work of Crossley, and perhaps Paul's article for me was the one that set me on the way to saying that it's absolutely fine to now start looking at the grey areas in coaching rather than looking to measure it. I really like the fact that it used sociology as well, as opposed to Again, looking at some rather linear forms of measurements in coaching that we quite often see in maybe coach effectiveness and coach behavior literature. So using the sociology to look at human relationships with each other. So it's one of my favorite academic articles. And what I would say is that academic reading, even for someone that works in this particular area, can be really hard work sometimes. This one isn't. I've really enjoyed reading it from start to finish. And it's one that I often pick up on a regular basis and share with students and say, look, if you really want to talk about the realities of coaching, read this. So I love it. And I'd be really interested to hear what the rest of you think about it as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I have to say it is a relief when you hear academics say that academic literature is hard to read. Like I'm not the only one sat there struggling going, I don't know, did they just swallow a dictionary? Why can't they just write in normal talk? I have no idea, but yeah, no, so that's good. I guess my first kind of question on this is, has vulnerability become a bit of a thing? Is it like the new popular thing to talk about? It just seems lots of these things do come in trends, but I've just seen it being discussed and yeah, I guess verbalized and shared just far more. And I'm just wondering whether you guys, is that been, from your perspective, driven by there's more literature around it, or there's more interest in it, or is it just got to a stage where maybe the nature of coaching has got to a point where we need to show that we are vulnerable and around the mental health piece and all of these types of things and relationships and everything else? Is it the current solution to where coaching finds itself? But it definitely, in my head, seems to be just a very, not a buzzword, but it does seem to be the buzz thing, I guess.
There's probably three things that might be influencing that. The first one is, like you said, some of the wider mental health agenda. When you think about how much pressure are we putting onto our coaches, get qualified, stay qualified, etc. And perhaps coaches almost seen as being service providers for young people in particular. I pay my subscription fee, so what do I get for that? I think there is a growing sense of emotions in sports coaching, in the coaching literature, led by people like Paul, Robin Jones, Chris Cushion, etc., who are driving some of this area of work. And yeah, I think it's a growing area, but I think there's also perhaps a sense of using reflective practice more meaningfully as well. So rather than evaluating sessions, which may focus more on performance outcomes and did the players enjoy that session and what did they get from it and how did they improve, is actually encouraging the coach to look within on a more regular basis. So whilst it might not be sharing your experiences with other people as much, but at least thinking on a more deep and meaningful basis on how we may be impacted upon the decisions that we made during that particular session. Why did I feel uncomfortable at that moment? And how can I contextualize that ahead of my next session?
I think for me, it's a really interesting concept and something that it's interesting to see when coaches might show vulnerability and to whom. Because if I think with my sort of refereeing hat on for a moment, if you show too much vulnerability to players, then they will quickly jump on that and that can become a negative thing for you going forward. However, if you show some form of vulnerability and do that in a manner which is supportive of you and your interests, and you are able to trust those others that you are sharing that vulnerability with, I think is key. So if it's, for example, for me, a throw-in on the halfway line, which I get wrong and hold my hands up and say, look, I've got that wrong to the players, they probably, some might have a bit of a whinge, but they wouldn't have hopefully too much of a whinge at that. Whereas if it's a key match decision, a penalty, a red card, and you show vulnerability there, and I think that has a very different impact, a very different consequence. In terms of coaching, for me, it's interesting to see when coaches might suppress emotions, when they might not show their true or their inner emotions, how they adapt those on the outside, if you like. They put on a different front, perhaps, and why they might want to do that. Or equally, when they do try to change their own internal emotions, what might the reasons be behind that? And again, why they're doing that in relation to the people that they are within that context alongside.
It really comes back to this point from earlier that there isn't a magic bullet. Vulnerability doesn't matter. You could list any element of coaching and it isn't the one single right answer. And just as Adam's pointed out, there's all these potential avenues that demonstrating your vulnerability could then lead down, and none of those are unproblematic. You know, they all carry some potential for beneficial influence, non-influence, negative influence on what's likely to then happen moving forward. And within a group of athletes, which we typically work with within team sports, but even within individual sports where they're coached simultaneously, that group of people that's experiencing your emotions is interpreting that. So it's not the emotions that you show with an intent or the emotions that you hide with an intent aren't things that doesn't pass unfettered to the person as if you've just implanted it, your intention in them as well. They are interpreting it, they're thinking about it, they're making sense of it, and they're wondering about it in ways that then shapes how they make sense of it and do things with that. And I think the kind of core message for me in relation to all of this is, if somebody says to you, I'll tell you what, is going to sort all of your coaching problems out, then just immediately stop listening to them and walk away, because they're probably going to tell you some nonsense. And it's possible that what they're going to talk about is a product that they're trying to sell you in some way as well. I think that's where a lot of the current literature, the really rich, rigorous, original and sophisticated research that's been done, frequently when you read it, provides this almost little statement in it that says, and incidentally, this is just one element of the bigger picture of coaching. We're looking at this in real depth, but we're not claiming here that this is the singular truth or the all-encompassing right answer to things. It's just nudging our understanding forwards a bit. And equally, I think mentors and coach educators are getting better in practice environments at being able to support people to say, let's look at this for a few weeks. But keep in mind that it doesn't mean that all that other stuff goes away. It's just that maybe we can dial up our attention on these sort of key areas that might make a real difference to your practice. And then let's look at how it takes time to embed and integrate those things that we've now learned about into the wider repertoire of the coaching that you're involved in.
I think Paul makes that point at the end of the article as well. It says, we're not saying that all coaching environments are calculating, uncaring, competitive, but many coaches may feel this way. What's nice is that at the end of the article, there's 3 sort of short stories from different coaches who kind of subscribe to that same way of thinking. He said, yeah, I felt that too. Interestingly, just maybe taking it on just another step, is that this way of experiencing a coaching environment is something I've noticed through interacting with some of the participants of my PhD as well, where some of these coaches in that particular environment are saying, I felt horrible about this situation. I've got a difficulty with dealing with that individual. And I then ask, what are you doing to resolve it? So, well, I'm not. Have you told anybody? No, because that's not what we do. So how are you internalizing that? I'm finding it very difficult. So what's the impact on the coaching environment? We just don't talk. We don't get on. We should be. So actually what I do is I use someone else as a broker to get to them. So someone is like a mediator in our relationship. So what that does is it changes the very shape of the constitution of that network. So that particular coaching environment is impacted upon that one difficult series of interactions between those 2 individuals has meant that everybody else now needs to moderate their behavior around them. So that changes the very network. So I think where this particular article shed a light on what I could be doing for my own kind of work moving forwards was, one, showing that the vulnerability and the nuance, but then got me thinking about what about that complex web, what goes on beyond that, and how do we use maybe individuals to bridge those complicated relationships, and how do we encourage coaches to maybe talk about it a bit more as well.
Where do you think that comes from in terms of an environment where you are looking over your shoulder or you don't trust people? Is that created? Is that somebody at the kind of the top of the pyramid fostering that? Or is that just potentially ignorance of that and it's just human connection or a lack of, and personalities clash and all those types of things? I appreciate, again, there's going to be a lot of nuance in there, but from your experience, does it tend to resolve around a figure and how they direct things, or is it just human nature and we just got to manage it as best we can?
This is going to seem like a cop-out, but it's a bit of both. Sometimes I think our interactions and the culture and the norms and the accepted practices will result from our interactions with each other in that coaching environment. We will help to shape whatever is deemed to be appropriate practice. However, I have also noticed the impact of an individual dropping into a particular environment, like a performance director, who will help to set the tone of that. And they will, through their guidance, will change the interactions and the shape and the beliefs of other people along the way. Yeah, that is a cop-out, isn't it? I'm actually saying it's both.
I think it makes sense that it can be both. It's never going to be either or, but I often find that because you get that kind of, in my mind, it always comes back to being a perception as well. And I've had the same thing. The DOR turns up and is on the touchline, and suddenly coaches start doing some stuff, and even players start doing some other things. And you chat with the DOR afterwards, and you just go, "Oh, what did you think of that?" They're like, "No, I wasn't even watching. Like, I was on my phone. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I'm just there to be seen." But suddenly, because people think they're being watched, and I can never remember whose kind of rule it is of observation, that inherently, as soon as you observe something, its behaviour changes. But you're only ever seeing or having kind of your perception of somebody else's influence on something. So yeah, I guess it's always going to be complex, but it is fascinating the impact that can have. In terms of does he talk about in the article about whether that's actually a positive at all? So I'm wondering whether an environment where you are on your toes, but you feel a little bit of pressure, does that enhance performance potentially? Or actually is there evidence that says that can be, I guess you can go to a point where it's too far, but is there too much pressure, and is it then a negative element of that kind of interaction?
I'd imagine for many, it could be a stimulating feature of the coaching to keep you on your toes and make sure that you're always ready to be a little bit better than everyone else. But I think ultimately from this article, it came across that it wasn't necessarily a world that he wanted to be part of anymore. He found that it was impacting upon his ability, therefore, to maybe mentor other young coaches himself, that those norms and accepted practices crept into his own behaviours. So therefore, he decided to walk away from that particular coaching environment because he didn't feel like it was a road that he wanted to continue walking down. Interestingly, I know other coaches that have done the same thing. They said, well, this isn't for me anymore. It's just become way too competitive. And I think that seems to be more prevalent in coaching in performance environments in particular, where those particular positions tend to be highly sought after. That whole, the stadium jacket, the free tickets for the senior games, in football in particular, the folded over tongues and the chewing gum, and the particular identity and the value that you have of being a performance coach at the professional club. And yeah, I think for many coaches, there's always a constant feeling that you're looking over your shoulder. Now, whether that comes from the club environment, as in the constant measurement and the CPD and the checking and the tick boxing of performance, or whether that is internalized by the individual from just noticing the fact that there are many other coaches with your qualification, there are many other coaches with experience similar to yours, and that you're a couple of bad sessions away from being given the elbow, or being, in this case with the article, dumped on by one of your supposed colleagues, someone that's stepping into your session and saying, no, that's not very good, is it? I think sometimes coaching can feel like that, where we're constantly worried about what people think of our performance. And I think, again, for me, in terms of my own research, this opened a door, but in terms of my own coaching, it did as well. It made me think, well, actually, it's okay to feel this way because there are other coaches that have felt that pressure too. I think, yeah, for me, I love this article.
It's one of the brilliant bits about the way these sorts of articles are written, because I think there's sometimes a perception that coaching research is challenging, not just because it's written in a particular language and because we're using precise terms and terms that have certain meanings, but also because sometimes the research is done in a lab and we don't coach in the lab typically. So the brilliance of this sort of research is that it's actual coaches talking about intellectualizing and thinking deeply about their own practice. And in this case, talking very honestly and authentically about things that don't always go very well. And I think that's, again, linking this back almost, this heroic image of the coach as the sort of omnipotent, in control, authoritative figure who's leading dynamically forward and everybody's going to follow is problematic, because it means that in reality, when we are finding things difficult and tough, we often feel that's something that can't be shared because it's a chink in our armor, and it might either lead to our athletes or co-coaches or other people to take advantage of that in some way. And this sort of striving for perfection and at the cost of everything else, I think has become much more publicly, or there's much greater public awareness of it now. And I think what it's doing is it's creating spaces where coaches recognize the value of having trusted critical friends, mentors, collaborators to whom they can turn in order to share and to say, I'm really struggling with this week, or do you know what, I've never dealt with this before, I don't know what to do. And certainly in my own experience as a mentor and as a critical friend, it doesn't matter really what level that's at. People are dealing with these things right from I'm a mum and I turn up on a Sunday and I help out with the session, to I'm an elite performance coach and equally, I'm really struggling with some of this stuff, and I'm questioning and I'm unsure about what I should do here. What should I show and what should I hide, and what are the potential consequences of that? And I think this is where there's great value then in creating spaces in coach education, university degrees, and CPD for people to be able to talk very authentically and openly about the things they've got and the things that they've got wrong, and about how they've experienced all the bumps and the slides and the opportunities and the challenges, so that there's a more authentic picture painted of the realities of doing coaching. Because I think we'll have a much happier coaching workforce. And I don't just mean that in terms of professional paid coaches, but I also think we'll have a much happier sporting context. Because, and this is one of the, I might get off on a tangent here, this is one of my bugbears around things like athlete-centeredness. So does anywhere athlete-centeredness say this is exclusively about the athlete, and actually all the sport should only be about the needs and expectations of the athletes? If it's only about that, how many volunteer coaches are we going to be left with? And maybe we need to think about this in a much more level playing field, or actually recognize that everybody who's taking part in and facilitating sport across all domains and levels, whether it's officials, whether it's administrators, coaches, parents, and athletes themselves, they're all people, and they all have rights, and therefore those rights present certain obligations to those that are interacting with them. And I think sport as a whole could take a really good hard look at itself in those, using those frames, and again drawing upon some of these stories which provide excellent evidence of the messy, complex realities, and equally good evidence of the potential and the opportunities that are there in ways that we could shape sport to be a better thing moving forwards.
I think it almost brings it back full circle in my comment around I guess it being a vulnerability being a kind of a buzzword or a thing at the moment. I almost see it similar to athlete-centeredness, that it was all good intentions and well reasoned and everything else, and then the coaching population pick it up and just turn it into this other thing. And this kind of the cynic in me says, how long till I hear coaches saying, oh, I'm a vulnerable coach, and it's in a Twitter bio, and it just takes on this life of its own, where actually the original meaning and intent just gets a little bit lost and it's not impactful. And then we actually start rejecting it because everyone goes, it's just a fad. What does it actually mean? And then move away from it. And I think we'd be missing a huge trick if we did that, because I think it is so important. And coming back to Ryan's point about that kind of self-reflection, it being deep and it being meaningful, I think it's so crucial. And I really hope this doesn't become that next kind of, oh yeah, everyone's vulnerable now, isn't it great? And then everyone's like, oh yeah, you've seen that vulnerability thing, now we need to do something else next. I don't know how we avoid that, to be completely honest. I guess it's keeping it maybe a little bit more grounded in the reality and understanding its purpose. But yeah, that's kind of my little soapbox moment.
Just to maybe offer some comment on that, I think part of this is about developing really good science communicators and people who can, rather than in a 240 character tweet, say, so I've learned about this thing and it's the answer to whatever, or can put on a 1 hour CPD session where they tell you the 3 things you must do in order to be the next best whatever coach. That actually we need to present things, like I said before, more authentically, and we need to start with an image of coaching being this complex, social, iterative engagement with a range of different people, and that's going to bring certain opportunities and challenges, and that we can become much more capable and astute of recognizing the different ways in which those interactions and relationships can go. And I think what that will then avoid is this, as you said, this sort of looking, it's almost like that marginal gains idea, or I'll marginally gain by I'll just do this thing and I just add this little extra ingredient in, and then that seems to have stopped working now, so I'll get this other ingredient and that now becomes part of my recipe. There just isn't one single ingredient that's going to make a good cake. And I think you're right in the sense that the literature of athlete-centeredness, when you actually read it, has some really useful things to say, but how many people who use the word athlete-centered in their description of how they coach have read any of the original literature of athlete-centeredness, versus they've heard the word athlete-centeredness on a course and the logic of it seems really relevant, and I like that idea. Of course it makes sense. I want to be centering practice around my athletes. But then suddenly that's their label. That's how they coach. I'm a questioning coach. I'm a games-based coach. And then you turn up and watch them coach and you think, that's not a game. I've not seen you ask any questions so far, or all of your questions are just like passively worded instructions or whatever to the athletes. And I think this is, again, where context and educators really knowing their subject and also knowing the people that they're trying to teach this subject to and support to learn, so that, again, the development of coaching is built around the needs of the coach in that particular environment, rather than just some stock knowledge that is deemed to be important for whatever reasons. And so there's this, I think there's a risk always of seeming bitter, in that we're painting this really negative picture of coach education and also of coaching as if it's all bad. But there's great opportunities to do some fantastic things about this. And it's really, again, about this generating a buy-in from people in positions who determine what is taught and how it's taught, that will be able to make that change.
I think that's such an important point, that where we can support coaches to become critical interpreters of information and of theories and of other practice, to understand really what can work for me in my set of circumstances with my athletes. And again, I think, as we mentioned right at the very start, acknowledging that one thing, even for the same athlete, might not work in 5 minutes down the line or in another session. So how can we critically interpret and understand, rather than just assuming that everything that we are told is perhaps correct and going to work as the next golden bullet approach? I think where we can, and obviously we are trying to do this in all of the educational approaches that we are taking, to challenge views that are presented to us and critically interpret the next theory or the next piece of evidence which is presented to us, to really get to grips with that and think, how does this work? And does this even work in fact at all for me when I'm operating?
I have to say, Ed, just in your last comment, I'm thankful for lockdown, because I'd have started to be a little bit suspicious you'd have seen me coach otherwise with your comments around it says one thing, does another. That's always that's always an interesting one. Part of that there, guys. But Adam, we are going to shift on to you. What is it that you're going to talk to us about?
Yeah, so my piece is a book which I've started to read quite recently, and it's called Leadership: Contemporary Critical Perspectives by Bridget Carroll, Jackie Ford and Scott Taylor. And I think for me, it really nicely takes quite a fresh view of what leadership is, and has some important implications, in my view, for coaching and how leadership or coaching is viewed more broadly. So I think what the book tries to do is to reposition leadership and really ask critical questions about what leadership is, challenges some very widely held views about or beliefs which dominate a lot of research, a lot of education and a lot of development opportunities perhaps. And I really like this point. I think I'll quote more or less direct from the book, in that they say, leading is not a momentary activity. It happens over time, changing continuously depending on place, who is present when leading is happening, and the negotiation of authority. So I think for me, that really nicely challenges some assumptions about what leadership is. And sometimes, as we've referred to earlier, this idea that coaches or leaders are heroic individuals who set a compelling vision and have these values which are unproblematically enacted, perhaps, to recognize the fine-grained details of what does leadership look like in different circumstances. And also recognizing that followers, it could be athletes, it could be assistant coaches, or it could be flipped on its head, but recognizing that followers themselves can also enact leadership, and that the agency which followers have and possess to make change, I think is really important to recognize. So I think the book also refers a lot about the fact that we're unlikely to identify leadership as being an essence of a personality trait, a mysterious or charismatic gift which people have or possess, an apparent ability to transform people and organizations, or being a function of the brain. But some of those things are important, but I think it critically challenges those views and again understands what does leadership look like in context for different individuals in different ways. And I think it links, it made me think a lot about my own sort of PhD research and research which is ongoing post-PhD about how we can critically understand influence and what actually influence is. And it speaks to a lot of what we've discussed to now, really, I think, in that influence can often be considered something which is perhaps easy to understand and some people say measure. I think where we can critically understand and get to grips with what we view as our intended influence and what that looks like in the eyes of others can be very different. So thinking back to one specific example in the PhD where the athlete had performed very well, taken a one-handed dive and catch to which the coach had praised them clapped loudly across the hall. And when I interviewed the two individuals, the player and the coach, from the coach's point of view, his intentions were to increase the confidence levels of the player, show to everybody else in the squad that was effective practice, and that was considered to be the norm, what people should aspire to. When I actually interviewed the player and showed him the same footage back from that session and said, before I even had time to ask a question, the player said, oh, I didn't even hear the coach say that in the session. I was just caught up in the moment at the time, just reflecting on the fact that I'd done something really well. So for me, that was a really powerful moment to consider and to challenge my own personal assumptions about coaching and influence, to think often because a player has a smile on their face or because there's been an apparent observable change of some form, that has been our influence, when actually this idea of influence is multifaceted and complex, and we as a coach play a very important role, but often a partial role alongside a number of other influencing factors or entities in that overall picture. So I think, yeah, to come back to the book a little bit, for me, it highlighted some of those power dynamics, those relationships between individuals, the ideas of followers enacting leadership themselves, and really this move away from a hierarchical view of leaders as heroes to understanding the social and the cultural context in which leadership occurs, and a very critical or complex view of that. So I don't know if I've done that justice in terms of giving it a synopsis, but it really resonated with me and some key messages, I think, to move forward with.
Do you think leadership as a concept suffers a little bit because it always seems to be quite black and white in its language? There's a leader or there's followers, and as you said there, it's probably far more nuanced than that even followers have leadership. So I don't know, I'd just be interested in your experiences of it as a concept and how it lives within organizations or sport. Do people suddenly just go, that's the leader, and okay, now I'm a follower? So we almost deliberately adopt roles, or actually is that just a perception of that, and we're all still leading in some ways and influencing other ways? And again, I guess it can get quite messy, but it always seems to be presented in a quite clean, neatly cut, there's one, there's a line, there's another. Yeah, interested in what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Phil, and I think you're right. We do sometimes assume that leadership and followership is this crisply distinct category which people have, and therefore they have certain roles which they should adopt or enact. And I think what education is moving towards, and what a lot of research, particularly in this area of critical leadership, is moving towards, is challenging some of those assumptions that followers almost don't have agency, because we know that they do. They have the power to change, in some cases, to follow a particular instruction or some feedback in a coaching context which is being provided, or to negate that. And I think, again, relating back to one of the examples in my PhD, where two coaches presented very conflicting or contrasting views on the way that the game should move forward. One advocating a more defensive style of play, and one advocating a very attacking style of play. And again, that the two players adopted very different approaches. Both went on to score hundreds in the respective game. And for me, that was a really interesting thing to think about, because as followers, they had enacted their own leadership, if you like. They had made decisions based upon the information, the constraints, the resources which they were within, and what had been provided to them in feedback or suggestions. But as followers, they took on an active role within that. So I think you're absolutely right. We sometimes do in education, or we sometimes in research, has portrayed this view of crisply distinct categories, but I think they wouldn't necessarily exist in practice itself. It's a lot more fluid, and understanding, as I say, that the power dynamics and why people feel that they can do or can't do certain things is very important, perhaps.
Do you think leadership groups can actually be a hindrance then, as soon as we bracket a group as the leadership group? I know there's probably strategies around moving people in and out of that group and various things, but I often think that suddenly if you're not in that group, then again, you're defining yourself as, well, they'll make all the decisions and they're the leaders, so I don't need to worry. And it seemed to be a kind of a very popular thing, and everybody at community levels all the way up seems to have them. And I completely understand the role of a captain. I think that's probably somewhat distinct, actually, the practicalities of needing somebody to make a finite decision on the field or pick up some of the responsibilities, all that sort of stuff. But I think the leadership group almost, to me, sits slightly differently, but I'm not sure if it potentially creates as many problems as it could solve.
Yeah, I think it could, depending on the again, probably the context that you are within and how that is positioned. I think it comes back to a lot of what we've spoken about in the really good discussions earlier in this podcast, in that where people can read the agendas of other people, where they can, whether that's hidden or espoused agendas which are on display, and where they can navigate some of those. If people are trying to move into a leadership position and they sell their particular approach by doing that, then I think that can be very effective. So I think, yeah, as you say, it's very different and for me, dependent upon the context that you are within in terms of how those relations between leaders and followers. And it might well be the case that in one particular situation, somebody who isn't traditionally viewed as a leader takes more of a leading role, and that is very impactful for the particular situation. But again, I think, yeah, for me, it would come down to those power dynamics and how over time, rather than leadership being this thing which occurs in a vacuum away from those relations and away from the historical lineage of what has come before that, understanding and recognizing that to harness, hopefully, the best possible influence for whoever is enacting leadership within that particular situation, perhaps.
It's interesting. I was really interested in the bit around the story with the coach, with the praise, and it got me thinking about my own coaching practice. And it's interesting sometimes for community coaches where a parent may say something like, "God, you're really quiet. Come on, coach, you're the leader." And I'm sure many coaches have had a similar situation where someone would say, coaches are the ones that beat their chest and shout the loudest. And it's what potentially might be valued most by those particular parents in particular. And I think for one particular episode I've had actually, where the star player's parent made a similar comment around, "Come on, coach, you're the one in charge. There are a try or two down here. You're the leader. Off you go." And I remember making a point at the time around making sure that the players could take ownership and they were the ones in charge. And then within a couple of weeks, I noticed that I was being a lot more shouty when this particular parent was around. And that was because I perhaps valued his opinion and maybe the conversation he might be having with his son in the car on the way home. And I wanted to make sure that I kept one of my star players. So it got me thinking about leadership and actually being the fluidity of power around that and the resources that we're able to offer each other, what you can gain from adapting and editing your behavior. Now, who's the leader in that situation? Is it me as the coach, or is it the parent who actually has resources that I want, i.e. his son, because he makes me look like a better coach? There's the vulnerability. For me, it gets me thinking about the fluid nature of leadership. I think I completely agree with Adam that it's not necessarily held by one particular individual. But for me, I think the important thing with leadership is those resources that we hold and how that is the thing that's fluid and where the leadership and the power then becomes more influential.
I think I'm just really conscious as well. Have you noticed that whenever anybody comes in, we always say, "I think"? So it's like, that's always the initiation of the conversation. But the thing that Adam really sparked off in the way that he described what's in this book is about this idea that it's negotiation of authority. And so we're continuously negotiating that. And I think something that maybe counterpoints with what Ryan just talked about is that actually sometimes you're given the label. So if you are the head coach, there is a certain expectation that comes along with the legitimate power that you have in that role to do certain things. And I've been very fortunate in my experience to work and to be able to get access to some coaches who would be positioned in these very significant roles at the head of international organizations. And they have had really interesting approaches to their leadership, which recognize that actually they're not only leaders, they're also coaches and they're also managers of other people. So they have this real sort of hybrid identity. And that at times, given the scope and the scale of what they do, they might actually have very little direct interaction with the players that are going out to perform, because actually they're organizing and they're manipulating, if you like, the chess pieces who are their assistant coaches, who are actually the ones that have a lot of the interaction with that. And equally, what the discussions made me feel is that leadership looks very different in different situations because it's continuously been negotiated. And I guess the key element to that is it's being negotiated between people. So at times, one of these coaches that I was observing, they typically tried to adopt a quite a democratic approach to things, and what that would look like was that they would ask lots of questions and they would try and get the players to come up with their own solutions to things. And it was a game in a very significant competition. It was half time. They were losing against this team that they should probably have been beating. And the coach sat all the players down and said, okay, it's all right, we're going to work through this. But you tell me, how are we going to do that? And the captain of the team just said, no, you're the head coach. You're getting paid this much money. We've been trying to sort it out for 40 minutes. You bloody tell us the answer. It's your job. And yet that player and the players that were around there in a different situation loved the fact that this coach empowered them by asking them to solve things, by giving them ownership over things. And I guess that's some of the complexity and the nuance that we often talk about. So when you say, I'm an empowering coach, I empower people. All right, so you're reinforcing the fact that you have the power to give that power away then, are you? So you're actually the person in power. And this is part of the thing that we need to do within coaching, is to unpick some of these simplistic ways of talking about the things that we do, the how and the why, as well as the what, and actually get into the nitty-gritty of, well, we thought about this in its proper context and what it actually means. And
is he going to come back? That's the
again.
Oh yeah, you're back. There we go.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know how much of that you missed. That's probably the kids watching Disney Plus, I reckon.
Damn them.
It's the gift that has given so much, and there's also the curse that's taken so much away.
As long as it's the Mandalorian.
Actually, it's World Book Day, isn't it? And it's Red Nose Day, and so the kids are all wearing masks. So our eldest son, his mask is going to be the Mandalorian's helmet, and so they're probably doing a bit of research on Disney Plus as we speak. Hence the poor internet connection.
Research on Disney Plus. I like that. That's the kind of research I can get behind. I'm conscious of time, but it's not a small question. So how much, we talked about influence quite a lot in this kind of last section. So how much influence do we think coaches have? Because there are definitely days where I'd be walking around a club being like, I've nailed this. Like, I've absolutely nailed it. I've got all the stuff aligned that I want to have aligned. It's absolutely rocking. And there's other days where you just go, would anyone notice if I wasn't here? Like, everything I've tried, nothing's worked. No one's listening. I don't actually know why I bother. And I always swing seemingly between the extremes of the coach is there to do everything and you have the power to do everything. And then actually you've got zero power if nobody wants to listen to you. Then there isn't necessarily an answer, but I'd be interested in where you guys sit on that ratio. Actually, how much can we affect and influence in our roles?
I think for me, it's just what Ed's just mentioned. You mustn't say, I think, yeah, in terms of coaching and understanding influence with players, I think understanding the different viewpoints of players and other coaches is absolutely essential, rather than just taking a one-dimensional view of how you think you as a leader are influential. While that's very important, also recognising from a player's point of view how they interpret and perceive that influence, as well as others in that context. I think that from a few of the examples that we've alluded to throughout this discussion, that can often be very different in terms of the initial intention for behaviour or practice and the perceived or the actual influence of practice itself. So I think I would agree with what you said there, Phil, that influence can be very different on different sessions in different contexts. And I think for me, just bouncing on a few of the points which have been made just before there about people having different interests, a good coach would be able to recognise and build sufficient alignment of those interests. We referred to earlier about people having a desire to just be told what they need to do at a certain time, whereas other people want to have more autonomy and more opportunity to make decisions. And for me, a good coach would be able to recognise those different interests and build sufficient alignment of those interests to work towards what they are trying to work towards, in recognition that, again, that's very complex. There are a lot of things that can get in the way of us achieving our goals, which we set out to achieve, and almost orchestrating the distance between those goals and the gap that is created by some of those conflicting factors.
For me, it goes back to the nuance again and the history of interactions with other people. If I've just come from a lecture and it's a really good one of the rare ones in the year where I've completely nailed it, and I turn up at training, my interactions previously that day have put me on cloud nine. I think I'm good at my job today. I'll go to training and my interactions with the players be positive. Again, it'll be on point, be some of the best sessions they've ever had. And similarly, if on a match day, I've had a bit of a stinker, if I've been the one with the whistle, or if the game hasn't gone very well, I'll go into the clubhouse. And if someone asks me about what do you think about the CPD coming up in the week, or we need to get more coaches for this particular age group, I could look at it one or two ways. I could either say, well, people still value me today, even though I've been pretty poor at my own coaching role. People may notice the fact that I'm in a lower mood and have the emotional intelligence to perhaps recognize that, just tell me what I need to know, because I just want to stop this conversation straight away. So I suppose similar to what we talked about in the first part with Ed and Remember the Titans, was around the history of interaction. I think for me, the ability to influence and then lead others, maybe as the result of not necessarily our interactions with that one individual or group of individuals at that particular time, but how our mood has been affected by other things in other aspects of our life earlier that day. And I think, yeah, I can be very good or very bad in those situations based on what I've done earlier.
Your summary seemed to nail it from my point of view, Phil. Sometimes we've got influence and other times we don't. And therefore the question really becomes, so what skills do we need, given that we operate in these roles that carry certain expectations that we will guide, lead, shape, influence, coach, manage people, that the people that have chosen and are being paid perhaps to be in that space with us. So again, it comes back to these key skills, which I think span what Ryan and what Adam's just talked about, this ability to read people and situations in terms of what is my potential to shift and move this person and or to affect this situation in particular ways, and what's happening now and what might happen further down the line, so that I can think about how I might act appropriately and in ways that changes or moves that situation. The second component then, I think, is then knowing myself. So I've got to have some intrapersonal self-awareness. I've got to know what I'm capable of and where I might be going out on a limb a bit and taking a bit of a risk, and also where I'm really secure in the type of authority that I might be trying to negotiate in a particular situation, maybe the types of leadership that I'm trying to enact. And then this final component is actually the doing of it. It's the interpersonal skills, the strategies that I might use in order to get people on side, to keep them on side, and to repair our relationships and their buy-in where that is damaged. Because as we've highlighted throughout, practice is going to be made up of alignment and conflict. It's going to be made up of cooperation and resistance. And it's in some of the work that we've looked at, it's the resistance that's been the sort of star of the show. And how is it that we've managed to lead our way through resistance, or in some cases found that resistance so significant that actually we choose not to take part anymore. And then on the flip side of that, we've had examples where actually we've experienced great cooperation with that, and it's enabled us to go on and to do certain things and to pursue certain outcomes or interests that are not only valued by ourselves, but also perhaps the people that are around us. But equally, none of that's unproblematic. So whether we're solving a problem or whether we're taking an opportunity, it's just moving us a bit further down our journey as a coach to another set of situations where we're again having to read people and situations, think about our sets of skills, and then make stuff happen. And I think all through this conversation, this notion of self-awareness, social awareness, and then influence as a result of that awareness has been the real golden threads that, unsurprisingly, given our own personal connections to one another, have been the shared sort of sites of interest for the conversation.
Fantastic. I think that's a great place to leave it. A really nice summary and just a really rich, deep discussion. Thank you very much. We'll just fire around quickly in terms of the kind of part two and your recommendations for people. Ed, we'll jump back to you. What is it that you're suggesting people take a look at?
So I think it would be great, and I've mentioned this before when I've been at different CPD events, reading this book called Sport Coaching Cultures. It's a book by Professors Kathy Armour, Robin Jones, and Paul Potrak. It was published in 2004, just the year after I finished at school, actually, and the year that really I started taking coaching seriously. It's probably the book that I've gone back to more than any other since I started really pursuing my understanding of coaching, and I think it offers perhaps the most accessible resource for anybody who's looking to take a step beyond their existing learning and development and maybe towards learning more about the science of coaching. And it does this by keeping its core focus on the real world experiences of some amazing coaches that the authors interviewed, including Sirian McGeechan and Bob Dwyer from rugby. And then it uses their really rich stories, and there's lots of sort of nuggets and insights in there in terms of what these coaches were doing, in order to then examine some sort of crossing themes across the different coaches' experiences, across pedagogy and the role of the coach and their interactions and their power, which tie into a number of the conversations that we've had today. So I think a great resource to be able to pick up on some of the threads that we've pulled out today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Ryan, what is it that you're suggesting?
Non-academic book. It's called Notes on a Nervous Planet by Matt Haig. I think in line with some of the discussions that we've had around coaching perhaps being slightly ego-driven on occasions, a bit calculating and uncaring, how coaches are constantly under ever greater pressure at a range of levels to be a particular person or to act in a particular way, that this particular book just reminds, it's not about sports coaching, but just reminds individuals just to take a step back sometimes, press pause. And for me, if I'm linking that to coaching, it's okay to scroll by that particular argument that might be happening on social media. It's okay to not engage in that CPD event if you've already done 3 this month. It's okay just to have a really bad coaching session. There's messages around there about just being yourself, being authentic, and to just feel grounded and press pause now and again. So I think that's really important for coaches.
Nice. Love the sound of that. Thank you very much. Adam, finish us off. What are you saying?
I think I'd like Ed's suggestion as well, and he's probably stolen one of mine, is sports coaching cultures. I think that the sociology of sports coaching, Robin Jones, Paul Potterack, Chris Cushion and Lars Tor Ronglin, is another really impactful source for me, and again got me thinking about some of these issues, some of these concepts, and really nicely relates to the discussion today of how coaches can perhaps understand some theory and in an applied manner as well, how that can impact practice, how we can think with those as tools which might help us in certain contexts and certain situations. Alternatively, I think there was a keynote speech from a conference that I was at a few years back in Worcester from Keith Davids and colleagues, and that's constraints in sports coaching. And for me, that was a really nice understanding again of their view of skill acquisition, and again how that can be applied to different situations, interactions between task, individual and the environment as well. So those would be my 2.
Sorry, it cut out slightly just as you said the name of the keynote kind of speech. Who was that by and what was it called?
Keith Davids and colleagues, and it's constraints-based methodologies in sports coaching.
Fantastic. Gents, this has been awesome. As I said a couple of times, I could have carried this on for a long time, and I think we've covered some fantastic stuff. So a big thank you to you. I'm going to round up the roundup. To everyone listening, we hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks again to my guests for their time and contributions to a really excellent discussion. Links to all the content discussed are available in the blurb on Rugby Coach Weekly. Please subscribe, like and share. As always, I'd like to thank you for listening, wish you all the best and go well.